I was raised here at Temple Beth Ellen Center, Reform Movement Congregation in San Pedro, California, near Palos Verdes, near the port of LA. And I will just tell you, when you were raised, at least in the Reform Movement of the 1970s, every year the religious school curriculum covered the holidays. But in addition to that, we always had the same 3 lessons. Sadly, our first lesson was always on the Holocaust. And just for the Jewish educators out there, I'm going to say, showing the French Holocaust film Night and Fog to first graders, not a good idea. Still suffering the trauma today. We learned about Israel and Zionism and the Zionist movement. And of course, our favorite part, when the Jewish National Fund sent those cards around, they had 10 slots and they were quarter-size slots. And when you could fill every slot with a quarter, you'd bring it in and you could buy a tree in Israel. For the mathematically challenged, that's $2.50. Now, we were told by the rabbi, one day, may you go to Israel and visit your tree. Well, I was really excited. When I first got to Israel, I went looking for my tree. Sadly learned that you actually have to donate 10,000 trees to JNF before you'll actually get your name on the tree. But at least the idea was a good one. Well, the third thing we always learned was about Jews and social justice. And this, one of the famous pictures of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and the marches that they participated in. Selma, of course, was the most famous. So with all of this in my upbringing, I arrived on the campus of Cal Berkeley, UC Berkeley, in the fall of 1992, ready to change the world. You see, if you don't know Berkeley, this is where Mario Savio led the free speech movement in 1964 that helped to change the world. And I'll just say, I did this talk for some congregations down in San Diego last week. And Rabbi Devorah Marcus, who's the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, I didn't know this, but her dad actually took this picture. He was one of the most famous sort of student photographers of the era. And so that was nice. So I told the rabbi that I would give her father photo credits as we work through this. So all of these protesters are seated in a place called Sproul Plaza. Sproul Plaza was the political center of the Berkeley campus. Here's a shot now looking towards Sproul Hall where Savio was standing. And what happens every day still on the Berkeley campus is different student groups will get a table and they'll put a lot of flyers and brochures and they'll set it up, and you sort of walk down the center of the walkway and you stop at the tables and pick up the information that you want. So of course, I went to the Berkeley Hillel table first to get all my information on Jewish life on campus. And if you can see, that is the Berkeley Hillel t-shirt. And so I'm imagining I have a lot of Hebraeus here today, so that's good. So that says Berkeley. But since it's not vocalized, you could play with the vowels and it could say Barak Li, a storm is upon me, or it could simply say broccoli and be the vegetable. So one year they actually added the vowels to avoid confusion, and I always loved that confusion. So after I went to the Hillel table, I of course went to the next table I needed to go to, the Black Student Union table. And there I met up with my African-American classmate, introduced myself and said, let's start a Black-Jewish dialogue. And he burst out laughing. And then he kept laughing until I have to believe he saw the shock and the horror and the embarrassment on my face, and with compassion did all he could do to control himself. And I think to ease what was really an awkward moment, he said 4 words to me. He said, "Hey, I'm from Harlem." Now, I'm assuming he knew that I knew what he meant. And I did know that Harlem was and has been an African-American neighborhood in Manhattan in New York City. But I really think when he said that, he was communicating a deeper truth to me. He wanted me to know that if you are a young Black man in America and you were raised in Harlem, you're going to arrive on the college campus in a very different headspace than a white middle-class suburban Jewish kid from the suburbs of LA. And at the end of this short conversation, he said, look, I don't think anyone in my organization is interested in Black-Jewish dialogue right now, but if you'd like, I'm happy to pitch it for you. And I appreciated the offer. I said, it's not necessary. Thank you very much. And that ended the Black-Jewish dialogue of 1982. And it started the first day on this book, even though I wouldn't know it for several decades, on how it went. Erev Tov, good evening, great to be here. Thank you, Rena, Kara, for all your work, for your organizing, and to all of you for coming to hear some thoughts and ideas, especially as we're in the midst of a national reckoning on race. I know that I have some academic historian colleagues here, so it's great to have you here. I'm going to be having some pop quizzes, and I'm getting myself set up for the pop quiz. So if you are a history professor at Yeshiva University, perhaps you're not permitted to answer these. You can do them privately to your family. They will be very impressed with you if they aren't already. But for the rest of you, when I come up with questions, if you go to the chat in the chat box, you are able to privately send me, Marc Dollinger, a chat. So feel free to send me one, and we'll go from there. So here is our first question. What is history? Actually, no need to answer that. That's the easy question just to warm you up, because history would be, most simply, the study of the past. I would like to introduce a more complicated word, historiography. And by the way, as I talk about historiography, if you have an idea of what this means, just go ahead and start typing. Now, I think you can see my pointer. Rena, are you able to see the pointer? If you just nod, I can see. Great, thank you. So I'm pointing around the word graph. Oh, by the way, history majors will get this. Former English majors could get the etymology of it too. And that is that to graph is to write. Here we go. Okay, Shira. Oh, this is excellent. Shira and Meryl, this is a very smart group. Since I'm the only one who sees that you accurately answered this, I'm gonna hold off on that for everyone else. To graph is to write. So this is the history of historical writing. Shira absolutely writes the study of the writing of history. Meryl writing about history, and then Ted tells us the study of historians. This is a very bright group, and I just want you to know I'm doing these talks sometimes 2 and 3 a day. In the first 12 minutes, you are already in the lead for the brightest group. So, so here's how it goes. About every 20 years, it seems, history changes. History doesn't actually change. Whatever happened, happened. But what changes is that the academic historian who wrote about that period is going to tell the story through their own lens. And their lens is informed by their gender, race, religion, age, any identity category you want. So as Joyce Appleby of blessed memory taught me in grad school, she was later to be the president of the American Historical Association, that history is more a study of the present's relationship to the past than the past itself. In fact, for me, the easiest example, at least when I was in grad school trying to learn this concept, would be, let's put you at as a white undergraduate at University of Mississippi in 1850. All right, you'd have to be white to be at Ole Miss in 1850. And you're taking the US history survey class, first year class, and the lecture's on slavery, and the assignment is read the textbook chapter on slavery. Well, what do you think it's going to say? If the textbook was published by the University of Mississippi Press and you're reading it at Ole Miss, it's going to say slavery was a really good thing. In fact, in the 1840s, they came up with 7 arguments why slavery was a positive good. That was the phrase they used. Well, let's put you at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the early 1860s. Same course, same slavery topic, but your textbook is published now 20 years later from the University of Massachusetts. What's its view of slavery going to be? Well, since Massachusetts is the center of the abolitionist movement, it's going to say slavery was a really bad, lousy institution. So if you took those 2 chapters from those 2 textbooks side by side, and you didn't know anything about anything, and you just read the 2 of them, you'd have no idea you were actually reading about the same historical event. So today's talk is actually not about history. It's about historiography. Today, we're going to dive deep from an academic historian's viewpoint into how it is that different generations of history professors have looked at the relationship between Blacks and white Jews and the civil rights movement. Oh, yes. The late Rabbi Dr. Professor Michael Signer, most recently at Notre Dame. Why use a monosyllabic when a polysyllabic will do? That's the motto for my career. So in that spirit, oh, there we have the definition, the study of how historians have studied the past. In keeping with Rabbi Signer, there's my favorite polysyllabic. That word is filio-pietistic. Anyone? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It's from the Latin. Piety, love. Filio, technically brother, but family. In academic history, as Ted says, the study of historians self-referential. Yeah, it's ethnic self-congratulations is what filio-pietistic means. In Jewish studies, it means, aren't the Jews great? And aren't we great? We are fantastic. And I know how fantastic we are because every 3 weeks or so, I get the email telling me how many Jews have won the Nobel Prize. So here's what happens in filio-pietism. The first generation of ethnic studies, Black studies, women's studies, Jewish studies, you can pick, will talk about all the great contributions of that group to society. And you need to do that because if you're the first generation writing in ethnic, racial, gender history, then you must capture stories that no previous historians have. Of course, if you're in grad school and you want to get your dissertation, you want to get it published in a book, you want a job, you want tenure, you have to kind of say that all the other books ever written before you are wrong and you're possessing truth. So the second historiographic generation says, aren't the Jews bad? And they're all the Jews are terrible books, leading the third generation to say to the first two, stop bickering, the truth is somewhere in the middle, and they write a whole bunch of books somewhere in the middle. And then the fourth generation, I don't know, they say, oh, you're asking the wrong questions. It's really about the environment. And then they start the process all over again. So here is a quiz for all of you, and Rena will be our judge. And you're all social distancing. I know, even though your positivity rate in New York is under 1%, we're jealous out here in California. Here's your challenge. In the next week, in conversation, use the phrase filio-pietistic historiographic analysis, and I'll mail you a prize. Now you can't say, oh, I was on this Zoom call and I learned about filio-pietistic historiographic analysis. That's too easy. You have to engineer a conversation wherein the phrase filio-pietistic historiographic analysis naturally occurs. And then when it's done, you'll win the prize. Okay. Historical memory. This book and tonight's talk is going to challenge Jewish historical memory. It turns out that we remember things in our own personal history, in our own family history, in our own communal history, that when we actually go back to the primary sources, the actual historical documents, we learn that it actually wasn't what we thought it was. So today I'm going to tell you history. I'm going to do it from an historiographic perspective. I am going to challenge the historical memory that you have. And finally, I'm going to challenge the historian's craft, the way in which academic historians do history. And at the risk of offending some colleagues, I'll tell you that when I went to grad school, we were taught that a good historian can write the history of any time in any place if they do it well. And of course, if we do it well, the academic reviews will say so. And if we don't do it well, the academic reviews will say that. And we were free as grad students to kind of imagine, what period of the world we wanted to focus on and what time period, and get started on our dissertations. Well, I was teaching a class at SF State just before the book was finished. And my colleague who was in the classroom before me was an African-American man, and he taught in communication studies. And one day he said to me, would you mind holding your students in the hall next week? I'm probably going to run late. My students are doing their oral reports and I don't want to have the door opening and closing to interrupt. So I said, of course, right on. I said, by the way, what's the topic of their oral report? And he said, they're assigned to talk about how their race and ethnicity informs their communication style. And of course, I mean, the course was called Race, Ethnicity, and Communication, so that makes perfect sense. And I said to him, look, we would never have that assignment in the Department of Jewish Studies, because in Jewish Studies, we want to attract, especially at a university like SF State, as broad and diverse a population as we can. Now, frankly, we're going to get the Jewish identified students and the Hillel students anyway, and we really want students who aren't Jewish as part of their college career to learn about Jews. So one thing I tell my Jewish students, I tell them all, but it's to the Jewish students, you can't identify yourself as Jewish in the class. And that's because we get kind of cohorts who all are in Hillel together. They went to Jewish summer camp together. They went to day school together. They're dating one another. They're breaking up with one another. They got a whole and then they come in as a group and they sit in the middle of the classroom and they're buzzing around. And then I walk in and they're in the center and they're controlling. And then the students who aren't Jewish are all in the margins kind of watching and not really engaging and participating. And I thought that my colleague in African-American communication studies would appreciate that we're both trying to create inclusive classrooms. Well, instead he looked at me and he goes like this. He says, he said, my Blackness is on every word I teach and every word I publish. I said, I know. And then he said, about a week or so later, when we got to know each other a little better, he said, your whiteness is on every word you teach and every word you publish, except you don't have to say so. And then, of course, it dawned on me. I was about to publish a book whose first 2 words was Black Power, and I'm a white man. So I called up my editor at Brandeis University Press. I said, I need to break the fundamental rule I learned in graduate school about academic history. And I need to out myself and I need to insert myself into the narrative, right? Which is something you're never supposed to do as a scholar. I already had an introduction in the book. So I said, I need to add a preface. And fortunately, I get along well with this editor and she gave me permission. So I say that to tell you that everything I've talked about so far is the preface of the book. I spoke about that I wrote about the Harlem Globetrotters game, about the Black Student Union student I met as an undergraduate. I share some stories about rabbinic students that I met when I was in the archives studying, which is all intended that the reader of the book, before they even start page 1 of the academic side of the book, would know how they want to assess what I'm saying, what my historiographic perspective is, based upon who I am as the writer. So with that, I present to you the 25th letter of the English alphabet, otherwise known as the letter Y. Now, actually, I was going to say that at this point, some of you who've read the book are having some of this ring true, I hope, because you remember what you wrote, what you read, and those who haven't, I'll introduce you. So this may look like the letter Y, but if we take a closer look, it's actually the filiopietistic historiographic representation which has plagued depictions of Blacks and Jews in the post-war era. Wouldn't you agree? Okay, for the visual learners amongst us, here's how it goes. Let's put African Americans up here, the upper left at the top of the Y, if you can see the cursor. Over here, we'll have white Jews. And you can see at the top of the Y, they're apart. But that's okay, because look what happens over time. They come together here in the center of the Y. This is the civil rights movement. This is King and Heschel. And look, they march together down through history. It doesn't matter what book you read in the first historiographic generation of Black-Jewish relations, it's the letter Y. It's 2 groups, used to be different, come together, interracial, interreligious alliance, march together in peace. Kumbaya. I call it the peace, love, and Bobby Sherman theory of history. Except that this historiographic approach fails after 1965 because the Black-Jewish alliance splits in the mid-60s. And you can't tell a story about how great everything was when we got together when in fact, it turns out the story is not the letter Y. It's the letter X. You see here, we have blacks on the top on the left over here. We have white Jews over here on the right. Look, they come together in the middle of the X, but let's be honest, historically, it starts, let's say 1954 with the Brown decision or the Montgomery bus boycott, pretty much ends by 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, or 65 with the Voting Rights Act, or the rise of Black Power, which we're talking about tonight. And then the Jews go in their direction, blacks go in another direction. And look, at the bottom here, the Black-Jewish alliance is separate. Now, what's perhaps nice is with the racial reckoning going on, it may be that actually the Black and Jewish communities are closer now due to all this. We can talk about that in Q&A if you'd like. But I will say this is the second historiographic school of thought. So all of the books in the second generation, rather than talking about how great the Jews were to get together in March, now it's like, okay, it was great, it came together, it came apart. And what we're doing tonight is exploring the next historiographic generation, because this book is pressing against both the Y theory and the X theory. So now it's time for a pop quiz. Those of you who've read the book may know the answers, and since you're writing to me privately, you can go ahead and do that, but just let me know you read the book, just so that those who can find it out on their own, don't feel bad. So here's how it's gonna work. When I'm able to actually be in a room and see people, I actually break everyone into chavruta study, and we get 2 of you on each piece of text to do it. Now we'll just do it together, as a class. So I'm gonna give you a quotation, a historical document from the book, but I've done 3 things to the quote. The first thing I've done is I've removed the name of the author of the quote. And the second thing, I've removed the year of the quote. And your job is to figure out who said it and when. Okay, if you don't know the exact name of the person, that's fine. The kind of person, like what would the description be of that person? And if you don't know the exact year, at least give us an era or take a guess. Now, I gave this talk at the Hartman Institute in Manhattan, and it turns out they're really smart in the Hartman Institute, and they understood that African Americans have been called different names for American Blacks, and they could pretty much date the quote merely by what word was being used to describe Black Americans. So truth and honesty moment as a history professor, I've changed them all up. So you can have absolutely no confidence that whatever word is being used will tell you the date. Okay, you're all ready? Here's our first quote. Black power stresses Black initiative, Black self-worth, Black identity, Black pride. Black power seeks the growth and development of Black economic and political power. Black power seeks Black leadership development. Okay, so go ahead, write in the chat who or what kind of person would be saying this, and when would they be saying it? Black power stresses Black initiative, self-worth, identity, and pride. It seeks growth and development of economic and political power, and it seeks leadership development. We're gonna go with Merrill. Thank you, Merrill, right on. Malcolm X, 1962. Okay, Shaya or Shaya, so I don't know how to pronounce it. And my daughter Shayna, so it's pretty close. Malcolm X in the early 60s, Adrian, Malcolm X in the late 60s. So I want Rena to know, this is the first time that I have done private chat answers. I love it because nobody knows that they're all giving the same answer in the same time period. So Meryl, Shaya, and Adrian, well done. So here is the big reveal. Let's look at Malcolm X. Oh no, it's the American Jewish Committee from 1969. How could that be? Now, a momentary pause. Meryl, Shaya, and Adrian, you have given the incorrect correct answer. Thank you very much. I wanted Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael with the other incorrect correct answer. Stokely was the leader of the Black Power movement to say that because look at this. This is absolutely Malcolm X. And in the middle of the 60s, early, late, I mean, it works. Malcolm would say that Black power stresses Black initiative, self-worth, identity, and pride. Yet, it turns out The American Jewish Committee said it in 1969. The American Jewish Committee, if you're not aware, a national Jewish self-defense organization. It's in the center politically. It might even be center to the right a little bit. This would be the last group I could imagine saying something like this. So actually, there's a new book out on the relationship between Dr. King and Malcolm X. So I was listening to a podcast on it yesterday. I didn't know that the two of them met only one time in their lives. And they were in the US Congress when they were debating the Civil Rights Bill. And I thought that was fascinating. What was more exciting for me is when they said in the podcast, the date that they met, March 26, 1964, which is like a random date for them to meet, except it's actually literally my birthday. Not just my birthday and birth year. Like literally my mom was delivering me in San Francisco when Malcolm and Martin were hanging out in Washington, DC. Like I got to believe that was somehow some kind of premonition to their career ahead. So here's how this is important in the historiography. If it's true that the American Jewish Committee has nice things to say about Black power, then the earlier generations of historical scholarship got it wrong. Because at least when I was raised in the 70s, to me, like everything was great until Black power, and Black power came in and destroyed it and kicked out the Jews, and they were anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, and members were all of those things. Therefore, that was the story, right? And that's what the book said. And I'm sitting in the archives, and when I see this quote from the AJC, I'm like, okay, there is actually another story happening here. There is a new historiography that has to be explored, right? D. Lipkin is saying that he's just started the book, Black Power Leaders in the 60s were more aggressive verbally against whites and racism. Yes, absolutely. And that's something that I would be surprised that the AJC, especially in 69, would say. Okay, text two. This is not a quote. This is just a straight up question. How would the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, respond to the Nation of Islam? And I'll just remind you, in case you don't know, I'm figuring most people here do know, the ADL is the nation's leading group fighting anti-Semitism. The Nation of Islam is right now Louis Farrakhan. It used to be Malcolm X. It used to be Elijah Muhammad, which has been anti-Semitic in its entire history. So how would the ADL respond to the Nation of Islam? Well, our thinking would be, of course, that they would condemn it and fight it. And well, here's what I learned in the archives. In 1959, Time magazine ran a cover story on Elijah Muhammad, then the leader of the Nation of Islam. And it was what you call in journalism a hit piece. Had said awful things about him, that he was anti-white, that he was anti-Semitic, he was a misogynist, and that was unsurprising. What was surprising is I was in the archives and I found a confidential secret memo written by the head of the Anti-Defamation League, Arnold Forster, to the heads of all of his regional offices across the country. And here's what that secret memo said. Time magazine notwithstanding, we have no documentable evidence of anti-Semitism on the part of the Temples of Islam movement or Elijah Muhammad. How could it be? How could the ADL of all organizations say that they had no documentable evidence of anti-Semitism when in fact they did? So how would the American Jewish Committee respond to the rise of the Nation of Islam? That was the ADL, this is the AJC. Well, for the AJC, their story occurs in 1959 as well, when Elijah Muhammad is rumored to be preparing to give a lecture in a northern New Jersey metropolis. Shall we say Newark? Okay, so he's going to give a lecture in Newark, and the AJC wants to surveil him to see if what he says, and if what he says is a threat to Jews. Well, I don't think there were Black Jews in the Newark chapter of the AJC in 1959 to go undercover, and I don't think a white Jewish person with a clipboard is going to do a pretty good job of making themselves unknown in the crowd. So in a relationship that's itself perhaps troubling, the AJC and the city of Newark got together. And the Human Rights Commission for the city of Newark had an African-American man who was a member, and he agreed to go in and surveil the lecture and take notes, and then take those notes and give those to the AJC. Well, the speech had between 1,500 and 2,000 attendees. And as a man from the Human Rights Committee wrote, Elijah Muhammad offered, quote, a cryptic statement that they killed Jesus and he was preaching good. Well, the AJC said that it was more concerned with the anti-white statements of Elijah Muhammad, and they did not consider his statement that Jews were Christ killers as anti-Semitic. So this makes absolutely no sense at all. And the beautiful part is when you keep coming up with documents that make no sense, and they're mainstream documents because AJC and ADL are as mainstream as they get, then there has to be something else going on that previous generations of historians haven't told. When 38 Black Muslims were in jail in Lorton, Virginia, they were, quote, forbidden to wear medals symbolic of their faith, although that privilege is accorded to Catholics and Baptists. What would you think would be the response of the the organized Jewish community to Black Muslims trying to pray in jail? Now, this happens to be the American Jewish Congress. Chad Polier, who's a leader here, is meeting with Dr. King. And what the American Jewish Congress did was they wrote a letter to the prison warden in Lorton, Virginia, to demand that Black Muslims be permitted to wear the right clothing that they need to wear, because religious freedom is protected in America, and American Jews value religious freedom too. On a strict level, it makes perfect sense for Jewish leaders to fight for religious freedom. I just don't think today we'd get national Jewish leaders fighting on behalf of Louis Farrakhan's imprisoned Nation of Islam members who want to pray. So something in the 1950s is happening. The long-standing African-American distrust of white people, born of oppression, is manifesting itself in a growing spirit of go it alone. Blacks were already, according to this person, reevaluating their alliances. They had come to know their strength in the political and economic arenas. The person who wrote this predicted a period of mutual irritation and misunderstanding, followed by a spike in what this person called new and more active forms of Black anti-Semitism. Okay, so take to your chat feature, if you haven't yet read the book, or if you read it and forgot, you can guess. Okay, actually, as you're writing this, I'm going to now give you the Professor Dollinger honor code of the evening. You could probably tell at this point in the game what's happening here. And that is that the answers we think are the right answers turn out to be the wrong answers, that we're getting the correct, incorrect answer. So when I do this live in the Chavruta, everybody has to write their answer down. And I do that so that they can't change the answer now when they know they want to flip it around to try to predict what it's going to be. So even though we know that you're going to be wrong, go ahead and play the game and give the answer you would have given if you didn't have the last half hour or so to see this. So the longstanding African-American distrust of white people is manifesting itself in a growing spirit of go it alone. Blacks were reevaluating their alliances and were coming to know their strength. So this could very well be African-American civil rights activist. It could be a Black Power activist. It could be an early, sort of just before the Black Power movement activist who was sort of predicting it. At least when I read it the first time, that's who I imagined wrote it, until I realized it was the ADL leader, Nathan Edelstein. And what's significant about this is not just that the ADL was saying it, but the fact that this was 1960. Remember, Black Power doesn't, yes, a Jewish author, Adrian, that's right. Nathan Edelstein did this 4 or 5 years before Black Power. So here's how I learned it in the historiography earlier. Blacks and Jews got along. Blacks and Jews marched together. Everything was great. Dr. King was peace, love, and brotherhood. Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, they were for division of the races. They kicked out the whites, which meant they kicked out the Jews. And everything went wrong because of Black Power. So that doesn't work if 4 or 5 years before Black Power, even white male older leaders of National Jewish Organization are talking about a long-standing, and he wrote Negro instead of African-American, long-standing Negro distrust of white people. In 1960, it's born of oppression. And guess what he said in 1960? There is a growing spirit of go it alone. As early as 1960, African Americans were already reevaluating their alliances. That's code for the Black-Jewish Alliance. They were realizing their strength. And guess what? The ADL said, there's going to be trouble ahead. There will be mutual irritation and misunderstanding. And guess what? Anti-Semitism is coming too. Once you read this historical document, you have to abandon at least everything I learned growing up about what caused the breakup of the Black-Jewish Alliance. And now we need to find a new way to see it. A segregated system. Oh, actually, so let me give you a little lead in before we talk about this. This is a document that comes from testimony before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Education. And what's happening here is the Senate is considering federal aid to education, which is a good thing. And this is the testimony of somebody coming before the committee. A segregated system is not merely an unfair system, but it is wasteful and inefficient. Nevertheless, we do not believe that a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy should be used as a means to attack the segregated school system. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially against children in the minority schools, we believe the bill should be supported. Now, I should tell you, I don't think I put this quote in the Black Power book. I think I put this in my earlier books. So even if you read the book, you know, we're all on a level playing field. So start typing in who you think would have said that or what kind of person would have said it, and I'll give a little bit more description, okay? So 1954 was the Brown decision. The Brown decision said that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Now, if we have any lawyers there, and I'm sure half of you actually went to law school, so you can impress the person you're with in the room if you can tell them the name of the Supreme Court case that the Brown decision overturned. Now, the Brown decision of 1954 overturned the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Plessy versus Ferguson case was actually with interstate railroads. It wasn't education, but what they said was you could have separate cars for blacks and whites so long as you funded them equally. Now, the truth is they never funded equally across racial lines. And as we learned in 1954, that even if they did fund equally, it's still inherently unequal. So what we have here is, and I'll go in the middle, so long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially, we believe this bill should be supported. That's the Plessy case. That is a defense of Plessy. And so I'll tell you, it's before 1954, it's before the Brown decision. We'll turn that over. And so Dan says a Jewish organization leader in the mid-50s. Adrian wonders if it's a black author. And D. Lipkin says possibly a Southern Jewish person. Three excellent answers. And for me, the best correct, incorrect answer is a Southern senator who was on that education committee. Because a Southern senator is going to make sure that a federal law equalizing educational opportunity by public subsidy, that's federal aid to education, should not be used to attack segregation. So let's take a look at that white Southern senator. Oh my, there he is, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, 1947. Stephen S. Wise, and since you're New Yorkers, you've probably seen and heard the name, founder of the Free Synagogue of New York, personal friends with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, leader of the American Zionist movement in his era, came under some critique for not sharing news of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, when he heard about it some months before it actually went public. So he is not a marginal Jewish leader at all. In fact, he's probably, with Abba Hillel Silver, one of the more important rabbis of his generation. So let's go back to his quote. Oh my, a segregated system is not merely unfair, but it's wasteful and inefficient. Nevertheless, this rabbi says we do not believe a federal law to equalize educational opportunities should be used to attack segregation. How he is supporting Jim Crow segregation. How could this be? So here's the backstory. As a rabbi, he wants federal funds for schools. That's very much in line with where much of the rabbinic leadership was in that era. And he goes from New York down to DC to testify, and he gives his testimony. And after the testimony, that's when the two white Southern senators pull him aside. And they said, Rabbi, they said, we know anytime the federal government wants to bring money to the Deep South, there's going to be conditions attached. So here's the deal. We're going to add an amendment to this bill. The amendment will say, you can have your federal dollars for education, but you can't use those dollars to undermine Jim Crow. And they said, Rabbi, we need you to agree to the amendment. And here's the thing. If you don't agree to this amendment, if we don't get the amendment passed, then this bill will never get out of committee. And now Rabbi Weiss has an impossible choice to make. He can help some of the kids in America with money by agreeing to the amendment and turn his back on racial equality, or he can stand for racial justice in America and no child is going to get a dollar to help them. And given that impossible choice, this is what he did. And now I want you to look at that top sentence. This is, I think, his moral compromise, right? When he says a segregated system is not merely unfair, but it's wasteful and inefficient. So that's his way of officially saying, I don't like Jim Crow, but nevertheless, right? And now he makes his deal. So we call this a white liberal gradualism, which means we're not a revolutionary country, or at least haven't been until the last few years have brought up revolutionary ideas on all sides. We tend to move in a more slow incremental pace. So for Rabbi Weiss, it's like, you know what? I can't help everybody at once, but I can help some people now, and we'll move it along and we'll work on racial justice as our next step. And that's what he did. To bring the point to this, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was only 18 years old when this happened, but let's just put him in the room for fun. If those two Southern senators came to him to ask him to agree to the amendment, do you think he'd do it? No way. Because that amendment effectively, not only does it not help Jim Crow, it actually supports Jim Crow, right? Because the federal government is now officially going on record supporting it. So this is a moment when Rabbi Weiss was enjoying what we now call white privilege. He had the ability to agree to this amendment because he, as a white Jewish leader, was able to make the compromise. And Jonathan tells us he wants to keep the Southern Jews from defecting to the Dixiecrats the following year. Right, and the Democratic Party is so complicated, especially when you get to the South and talk about race. If that's another talk of mine if you're interested. So, so there's Stephen S. Weiss. I'm tired of the philanthropy of rich white men towards your race. I want to see you fight your own battles with your own leaders and your own money. We white men of whatever creed or faith cannot fight your battles for you. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with you until you can fight as generals all by yourselves. So as I talk about this, go ahead and put your guesses in there. I'll help you out. It says we white men, it's a white man. And at this point in the evening, okay, it's a Jewish white man. We'll probably got that one done too. So any sense on which Jewish man wrote that and when? This person is tired of the philanthropy of rich white men towards your race. So I'll tell you, he's speaking to an African-American audience. I want to see you fight your own battles with your own leaders and your own money. That basically, you know, white people can't fight the civil rights for you. We'll stand with you, but guess what? There's a moment when you're going to have to be generals all by yourselves. So if you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, here he is, Joel Spingarn, 1914. Murray Friedman of blessed memory is actually the one who found this quote. I want to give him credit. And this is the most shocking of all. Joel Spingarn was the founder of the NAACP with his brother Arthur and W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to earn the PhD from Harvard. So this is not a marginal character in American Jewish life. You could probably call him one of the most important Jewish social justice activists of his generation. And in front of a Black audience, he's letting them know he's tired of the philanthropy of people like himself towards Blacks. He wants to see Blacks fight their own battles with their own leaders and have the money to be able to do it. And he says, look, we'll be shoulder to shoulder until you can fight as generals all by yourselves. This is a call for Black power. He is predicting Black power, and he's doing it 50 years before the Black Power movement. By the time I got to the Joel Springarn quote, it was really clear that there needs to be a revision in our understanding of all of this. And here's perhaps the irony of it. I actually was uninterested in any of these questions when I started this book. I was interested in the Jewish ethnic and religious revival of the late 60s and the 1970s. The first title of my book was going to be Turning Inward, and I wanted to examine the American Jewish turn inward. And so I started, in the 1970s, and then it kept sort of drawing me back through the 60s and even into the 50s, and then finally to 1914. And then I wrote the book in that direction. So in keeping with the spirit of our correct and incorrect answers, perhaps the saddest element in this whole frightening picture is in the fact that Jews are the people who are best able to understand the rhetoric of Black power, even though they're most directly on the firing line of its attack. And I think you could probably guess already, this is going to be a Jewish person. In fact, it's none other than Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, Columbia University professor, congregational rabbi, author of many books, most famous probably The Zionist Idea, still an important book in Zionist ideology. And what I was fascinated by was that in 1966, which was the center and the height of the tension between Blacks and Jews, he said that the saddest element in what he knew was frightening was that Jews should be able to understand Black power, even though Jews are most directly on the firing line of its attack. So he's standing there in the middle of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism from African-American militant leaders. Yet he sees something that I at least hadn't seen before. And in fact, when I read this quote, I said, that one's going in the book. And in fact, this quote, because I found it early in my research, it guided me the entire time. This is essentially the thesis of the book in one sentence, that the saddest element in this whole frightening picture is that Jews are the people who are best able to understand the rhetoric of Black power, even though they're most directly on the firing line of its attack. So the positive aspect of Black power is its search for ethnic identity. This we should be able to understand and approve. The American Black today is in this respect retracing precisely the experience of American Jews a generation or two ago. So if you got this quote, an hour ago and you were, trying to figure it out, you'd probably say it's an African-American leader talking about how good Black power is for searching for enabling ethnic identity. But it's Rabbi Roland Gittleson, chief rabbi then of Temple Israel of Boston, 1969. Rabbi Gittleson in 1948 was on Harry S. Truman's White House Commission on Civil Rights. In the 1950s, it was his congregants who went down the Mississippi to register voters, got arrested, got thrown in jail in Parchment. So if there's ever going to be a Jewish leader who doesn't like the rise of Black power, it's going to be Gittleson, because he was around in the Truman, Eisenhower, through all the administrations. He was the one committed to the peace, love, and Bobby Sherman approach. And when the Black power movement fractures all of that, I would have had Gittleson top on the list criticizing Black power, but no, he finds it has a positive aspect. Searching for ethnic identity. This we, and then he wrote Jews. I took it out so you wouldn't know it was a Jewish person. This we Jews should be able to understand and approve. He said this in a sermon, by the way. So in his sermon, he's calling on his congregants to approve Black power. He called it the American Negro. Today is in this respect retracing precisely the experience of American Jews a generation or two ago. Not only does he approve of Black power, he sees in Black power an American Jewish story. And he sees African Americans trying to fight for their rights in America as the same thing Jews were doing 20 or 40 years earlier, before we, certainly by the 1950s, were able to live in a country that was much less anti-Semitic than it was before. Which group benefited most from affirmative action in the 1960s? Typically, this is supposed to be, so by the way, affirmative action programs were designed to help historically designated minority groups. Jews did not qualify as an historically designated minority group in the 1960s, so Jews were not eligible from affirmative action. I want to start that. So the question is, which group benefit most? Roxanne is telling us that Joel Springhorn died in 1939, was active in the 20s and 30s. It's so interesting that the Black Jewish sensitivities go back that far. Yes, thank you. That was the point of that document. And when you comment a bit later on Eric Ward, I can bring that up during the Q&A. I actually was on a panel with him for the New York Federation about 3 weeks ago, and he gave me a really good quote, which I'll be happy to share. Okay, which ethnic group benefit most from affirmative action? You're supposed to answer African Americans, because that's what affirmative action was created for. And since we know the answer can't be Jews because Jews were not eligible, the answer is Jews. But wait, they weren't eligible. How could it be? Turns out women were eligible. And because women were eligible, Jewish women were eligible. And Jewish women were better positioned to be ready to go to undergraduate education in the mid-60s, and then to grad school, and then to professional careers. That the benefit affirmative action brought to Jewish women made Jews the #1 beneficiary of affirmative action. So this is important in terms of taking a gendered view on this, because many of the arguments against affirmative action is it's bad for the Jews, or it's contrary to meritocracy. Well, it's actually not bad for the Jews. It was actually great for the Jews, unless you forget half of the Jews in your analysis. I've only found 2 articles that give a gendered view of affirmative action. So if I get any potential grad students in the future that are interested, I'm going to put them on this topic because I think it would be fascinating. Well, when I was researching my first book, I went into the archives in Cincinnati, and I was researching the Freedom Rides. And I went into something called a card catalog. We used to have those back in the day. And the card catalog said Freedom Ride 1971, which was a typographical error because the Freedom Rides was from the decade earlier. But I pulled up the folder anyway, and the folder at the top said, you know, Freedom Ride 1971, same mistake. Turns out it was a Freedom Ride from 1971. As you can see from this picture, the Freedom Ride was not for Blacks in the South to get racial equality. It was for Soviet Jews to get freedom from the Eastern Bloc. What happened was a group of American Jewish activists and Soviet refuseniks got on buses actually in Washington, D.C., and then they went cross-country to Seattle, stopping in city after city in order to promote Soviet Jewry, raise money, and raise consciousness. Now, what's fascinating about the Soviet Jewry movement is that 1/3 of the Soviet Jewry activists were actually trained in the civil rights movement. And before we went live, we're talking about Yaakov Birnbaum, who was the leader of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. And when they asked him about it, he said, many young Jews today forget that if injustice cannot be condoned in Selma, USA, neither must it be overlooked in Kiev, USSR. The way in which the Soviet Jewry movement made it onto the national scene was by leveraging anti-communism, which is a nice way of saying that the US Senate probably didn't care so much about Jews as much as it cared about making the Soviet Union look bad. So when they had an opportunity to call for freedom for Soviet Jews, it was an opportunity to make America the democracy and the Soviet Union the communist state. So here's the historian's question. If you were going to leverage anti-communism to get Jews out of the Soviet Union, your movement should have been going a decade earlier in the mid-50s and the early 50s when McCarthyism was at its height. Except in the 1950s, you're not going to get a bunch of new suburban Jews willing to march in the streets for Soviet Jews. Because in the 50s, they were all about becoming American and mixing in and blending in and assimilating to the white Christians around them. The Soviet Jewry movement nationalizes in 1964, the same year of Black Power. And now, I argue, these young civil rights activists like Birnbaum, who were marching in the streets for African Americans and are now told after Black Power, there's no room for you in our leadership, go do your own thing. They're like, great, I'll go do my own thing for Jews. So I argue that the Soviet Jewry movement took a page from the Black Power Strategy Handbook. And in the chapter I have in the book on the Soviet Jewry movement, it traces the lines from civil rights and Black Power to Soviet Jewry. And since it's an Orthodox shul, I'll also share that the Soviet Jewry movement is really the first public grassroots protest movement that brings the Orthodox, the Dati community into the streets fighting for, in this case, Jewish rights in the Soviet Union. And what I love about that is what we're going to see now in a lot of the Soviet Jewry protests is bringing in a lot of Jewish ritual, a lot of Hebrew, a lot of textual commandments. And if you compare the secularness of Jews in the civil rights protests against the religiosity that was happening in the Soviet Jewry movement, I see, a fundamental transformation from the secular to the religious. And my thesis is, of course, that it's coming from the Soviet Jewry movement. Zionism as well. In 1948, American Jews were, of course, very happy with the creation of the State of Israel, relieved, certainly because of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, and the refugees that needed statehood. And something happened after the Six-Day War in 1967. American Jews responded to the Six-Day War in ways that were even more powerful and profound than 48. In New York City, they raised $18 million in 1 hour. A public opinion poll found 97% of American Jews expressing strong sympathy for Israel. 7,500 college students traveled to Israel in order to help the cause. So what I found was that this theme was coming up in rabbinic sermons. This is Rabbi Dov Peretz Elkins, who was at the Princeton Jewish Center when I was there, but he was in Philadelphia before that. And Adrian Letts reminds me that we have conservative shul as well, so welcome to you. And Rabbi Dov Peretz Elkins, of course, is from the conservative movement, if you know Rabbi Elkins as well. And in a sermon, he said, Black power is nothing more and nothing less than Negro Zionism. He drew the connection directly. Our friend Rabbi Hertzberg, calling Stokely Carmichael the leader of the Black Power movement, the most radical kind of Negro Zionist. He talks exactly the language of those Jews who felt most violently angry at the sight of Hitler and most hurt by the good people who stood aside. Now, Black power is not only the enemy, Black power is a friend to the Jews, and Black power is Zionism recreated. Rabbi Gittleson, the Black power advocate, is the Negro's Zionist. Africa is his Israel. Shad Polier of the American Jewish Congress again. To the British people, the Stern Gang in Israel was no less extremist than the Black nationalists, the so-called Black Muslim movement in the eyes of the American people. Ben Halpern said that Black power's fundamental meaning is quite clear. It's exactly the same as the equally vague term of auto-emancipation with which Jewish nationalism began in the 1880s. It was stunning to me how deep the connection was between these movements. And this is my favorite picture. You see, at my alma mater, the University of California, Berkeley, they started an education abroad program after '67 to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the only article I could find on this, there were some Berkeley undergrads who went the first year, and they had bell bottoms and beads and long hair and marijuana and free sexual liberation. They were the Berkeley in the 60s crowd, and they show up on campus and meet their Israeli brethren, who are at least 3 years older, conservatively dressed, short hair, and like last week were in battle. So when they look at these Berkeley Jews, they think they're freaks. And the Berkeley Jews think that they've come home to discover their authentic Jewish selves. So if you can imagine the scene, just the visual scene between these two, my argument is that these Berkeley Jews were actually being more American and more 60s than they were being Jewish. Return to tradition. There was a Baal Tshuva, a owner or master of the return, a return to tradition that occurred in this period too. Lots of Jewish young people got kosher, got more kosher than their parents, wouldn't go home to eat in their parents' home anymore because it wasn't kosher enough. They wore Jewish clothing in public, they wore kippot, and they read Jewish books. So the easy question is, what was the most popular book published by the Jewish Publication Society in Philadelphia? That's Torah, it should be. The more challenging question, what was the second most popular book? The Jewish Catalog. Now, if you're not familiar with the Jewish Catalog, it's How to Be Jewish with Macrame. It was a Jewish version of the Whole Earth Catalog, sort of how to knit your own kippah, how to braid challah, and it was purchased by countercultural young Jews who wanted to learn Jewish ritual and practice. And in order to want to buy the book, some things have to be true. First, you have to not know anything about being Jewish. And second, you have to want to be Jewish. And that was true for these young people because they were brought up in the 50s when their parents were in the white suburbs not promoting their identity. Yet through the mid 60s, when all the ethnic, racial, gender groups after Black Power were discovering themselves, they wanted to discover their Jewish heritage too. So if you look carefully, this says the first Jewish catalog. They added the word first because they had a second Jewish catalog and a third Jewish catalog, and they had a Jewish kids catalog, but they didn't have a fourth Jewish catalog. Because by the time they would have printed that after all those years, the young people that bought the first catalog got married, had kids, sent them to shul, summer camp, day school. They learned all they needed to know about Judaism. They wouldn't need to buy any book to tell them how to be Jewish. So if you want to look at the Jewish religious revival, just look at book sales for the Jewish catalog. Now, there was a countercultural as well protest in the 60s. My favorite one was the Radical Student Union at Cal Berkeley and Stanford, the rival school, got together. And this is not them, but I have them as my stereotypical countercultural Berkeley group. They took over the office of the San Francisco Jewish Community Federation on Friday afternoon. They did it was a sit-in, but they didn't call it a sit-in. They called it a pray-in. And they davened. They davened Shabbos. And their statement was that Federation was run by secular Jews who were more interested in status and prestige and less interested in education and Jewish identity. And they demanded greater funding for the Jewish day school in San Francisco, or they wouldn't leave. And I thought, wow, what a great way to bring the earlier civil rights into Jewish identity. I've been describing a lot of left-leaning groups, also right-leaning groups. The Jewish Defense League, Meir Kahane, followed Black Power. In fact, he loved the Black Panthers. His record on race and racism was terrible, and he appreciated that Black Panthers were arming themselves to protect their communities from harm. And he wanted to do a Jewish version of Black Panthers. So Shaul Magid is actually writing a biography now of Meir Kahane, so he's going to get a lot more in depth on that. But I argue that the JDL owes as well to Black Power. So now the question is, if we've had the Y historiographic school and the X historiographic school, what letter of the alphabet describes this new version? And I'll just let you know that since there was an X and a Y, I kind of figured we have to have a Z. So I picked Z before I figured out how to make the Z work. Some people have offered an H. Okay, Audrey offers an S. That's fascinating too. So here's how it goes. We're up at the top of the Z. Oh, look, Blacks and Jews marching together in civil rights across the top of the Z. Isn't this great? Oh no, Black Power. They split, they divide, they move backwards. But wait, after Black Power, Blacks and Jews are on a parallel path, even though they're apart. So even as Black militancy goes to Black Power, there is a Jewish militancy that goes to Jewish power too. And everything was good until I went to have lunch with my friend Ilana Kaufman. If you don't know Ilana, she is the founder and president of the Jews of Color Initiative. She is now a national leader in the Jews of Color community, an African-American Jewish woman. And I'm telling her all about my book, and and she looked at me and she said, Mark, she said, you've written 200 pages on Blacks and Jews and not a single page on a Black Jew. How could you do that? Well, I gave her my instant answer, which is, well, there weren't very many Black Jews in the 1960s to write about, right? And then she challenged me again. She said, look, she said, you wrote a book about how being Jewish was really being American. It's really being 60s. It's really being Black Power. That line between Jewishness and Americanness was the book. What if the line wasn't between Jewishness and Americanness? What if the line was between Jewishness and whiteness? What if you went back and reread each of your chapters, and instead of having it a story of whether Jews were American or Jewish, if the story was if Jews were white or Jewish, and explore what each of those two words, she said it would be a whole new book. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. And guess what? That's, for me, the next historiographic generation. Now, this is a little bit self-serving because when you're in grad school and you read all the books they give you, your job is to call these brilliant professors idiots so you can legitimate your own dissertation and get it published. And now that I'm middle-aged and grad students are reading my books, now they're going after me. So I at least wanted to call myself out, and in the epilogue, say that the next version should be from perspectives of Jews of color. And I have this slide up because at the time Ilana and I had our lunch, the URJ, the Reform Movement, and the NAACP were recreating the Selma March 50 years later. And they were going from 200 Reform rabbis from Selma to DC, and then they're going to do a voting rights rally. All sounds great, except my critique was for these Reform rabbis, many of them friends of mine, who are going to go back and think that they're Rabbi Heschel, who prayed with their feet, even though that's not actually what Heschel said. And that's a little self-serving. I was wondering if they're going to understand the depth of the challenge around systemic racism when they were, are you ready for this? And you know how the Facebook pictures are going to be. Okay, here's the Facebook picture. With all due respect to this rabbi, all the rabbis had it. White rabbi, Torah, black NAACP member. And Ilana said to me, where do I fit in this picture? And as we got into it, like literally, where are black Jews and helping train? I think that's Bernie holding up the banner, by the way, Bernie Sanders. I'm not sure, but I think that's him, or maybe it's his lookalike. Ilana said, how does the existence of black Jews complicate this whole question? I used the phrase black-Jewish relations. You can only have black-Jewish relations if Jews aren't black, because otherwise they're not relating. So not only did I not have any black Jews in my book, I had an assumption in the whole framing of the book that Jews of color didn't even exist. So with this, I asked Ilana for her permission to tell the story that I just told you and to make that the epilogue. So the epilogue of the book really goes from 1980 to the current period and uses this particular march in order to frame it. So when American Jews thought they were becoming more Jewish, they were actually becoming more American. Only in America and only in the 60s could they be so Jewish. This isn't a story of Jewish ethnic revival. This is actually a story of Jewish assimilation to black nationalism. There was indeed a black-Jewish alliance after the mid-1960s. It just looks a whole lot different than we thought. Thank you, and I'm happy to turn it over to Rena for however you'd like to proceed.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating overview of the book, and you really did turn at least my core understanding on its head. So that was wonderful. And I do have to say, first of all, if anybody would like to ask a question in chat, please do so now. We have time for a few questions, but I just have to tell you one thing. When you put up the photo of the Berkeley counterculture group of people in the 1960s, top row toward the left is my husband, David Lichtenstein.
No way. Oh
Yep.
my gosh. Hold on, I'm going to write that down.
He's got the beard.
That's fantastic. I would love if you would send me more information on that photo. I found it, but I didn't know the story. That's great.
Yeah, it's on our refrigerator.
Oh, that is beautiful and so unplanned. I'm feeling really good right now. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, all right, I'm getting some questions. Here's the first question. I am a member of a venerable institution of learning in New York. It's an institution of mental health training, education, and treatment. When the subject of Black Lives Matters comes up, a few individuals, one from the tradition of mid-20th century American Jewish political engagement, the other an Israeli who came to New York some time ago, refused to engage with the issue of race relations in the United States without bringing to the fore anti-Semitism in the Black community. How do you understand this phenomenon?
Thank you for that question. And I will let you know that is the #1 question I get. It is almost always the first question I get. And it doesn't matter what my talk was on, that's always the first question, and it has risen. So I do a talk on Jews and racism, and I actually included that in the, I just moved it into the talk to get it in advance of the question. First, I want to send everyone to read Evan Traylor, Traylor, Evan Traylor. I'm going to, actually, I can chat to everybody, I think. So yeah, I'll put his name here in the chat. Evan Traylor is already a national leader in American Jewish life, as well as in Jews of color. He's an African-American Jewish man, just started rabbinic school like this month at the Hebrew Union College. And he was the national leader of the Reform Movement Youth Group, and he worked for the URJ before he went to rabbinic school. And Evan wrote on his Facebook page a note to white Jews about using the expression Black anti-Semitism. And it's on, I think it's on medium.com, or you can just send me an email and I can forward it to you and you can look it up. So I was on this panel, this is good, Eric Ward comes in here too. So I was on this panel with the New York Federation, and they asked that question, and fortunately Eric Ward, African-American civil rights leader, nationally renowned, in case you haven't heard of him, he took the question and I just took notes. So he told all these, New York donors that he's done extensive study on the root cause of anti-Semitism, and the root cause of anti-Semitism in every single case he studied is anti-Semitism. Every time. Because he is arguing against applying group-based status to being an anti-Semite, which is, I think, great. Because as Jews, certainly we don't like having group-based status against us on anything. There are anti-Semites who are Black, there are anti-Semites who are white, and if we're not going to label white anti-Semites as white anti-Semites, and by the way, I'm saying this from a position of having done this in all my books. I write Black anti-Semitism everywhere. Some of my learning and reflection is to now talking about anti-Semitism within some elements of the African-American community, lots of words like that in order to figure it out. Because it's true, there are some folks in the African-American community who are anti-Semitic. And we should fight anti-Semitism anywhere and everywhere it is, because, by the way, I'm not speaking as a scholar now I'm just talking to you from my experience, because that's what we should do. And there's nothing intrinsic about being Black and being anti-Semitic. The deeper challenge is whether or not, in this case, it's usually white Jews who are saying this, are going to sort of, quote, take our ball and go home and not support racial justice because it turns out there are some people who are Black and anti-Semitic. Turns out there's people in the United States Congress and Senate who are saying things that are bigoted all the time, right? So what I'm hearing, and I'm not here as a political activist, I'm a scholar, so since I get this question a lot, I ask my activist friends, like, well, how do you answer that? And what they said is that they think if their goal is racial justice, they should fight for racial justice and go and fight it. And in fact, if there's going to be a problem, and it's anti-Semitism, but I also think anti-Zionism even more, right? Without getting into the distinctions between the two, there's a lot of anti-Zionism going on. If you want to have a conversation about what the state of Israel means to the Jewish people, it's a whole lot better to have that with someone when you're sitting next to them fighting for their racial justice, because that's the way solidarity occurs. Conversely, if Jews sociologically withdraw from racial justice until we can get appropriate condemnations on anti-Semitism, then it's actually going to make it even more challenging for us in the long term. So that's a more practical response to the question, but the academic response is that that anti-Semitism, exists everywhere, needs to be fought everywhere. We just have to be careful about how we typecast it and then what kind of demands we make.
Okay. Question, what do you make of the founding in 2019 of the Congressional Black Jewish Caucus, co-founded by John Lewis?
Yeah, thank you. I got some news calls for that when it happened, and sadly, I haven't heard much about it since then. It sounded great, and if I can, I'll use that specific question to go broader, which is that my book is, I guess, a little pessimistic when you talk about the split. I was trying to be optimistic to say, look, even though Blacks and Jews have split in the last 50 years, we're doing the same thing on either side. And what this Congressional Black Jewish Caucus is doing is trying to bring that X back together, or that Z back together again. And I think what's happening in the national reckoning on race is the same thing. These protests that broke out across the country were interracial, intergenerational, and in cities and towns we never imagined protests would happen, and pretty much without leadership, organized leadership. Like everyone just took to the streets. We didn't see this in the 1960s. And I'm arguing as much as I can in the short few months we've had, it's probably been Reconstruction since we had this level of national attention to the issue. So I think that this congressional group will be more empowered thanks to the larger national trends. And what we're seeing now are white Jews in allyship with African Americans marching side by side again. And I was going to say like they did in the 50s and early 60s, but it's different. Because what the documents showed in the book was that even white Jewish leaders in that era knew the intrinsic difference between racism and being white in America, anti-Semitism notwithstanding. And the young people today, the young generation, they get all of that, and they are joining in solidarity in a way different than it was in the 50s, and in a way that actually respects a lot of the quotes that we read today. So I am more optimistic that we will actually see an interracial alliance that's side by side.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. James Baldwin pointed out many years ago that when Jews pick up guns to defend themselves abroad in Israel, they are celebrated for it. When African Americans did so, they were vilified. What would it look like today for white American Jews to defend homegrown self-defense efforts, a kind of African American Zionism at home in America?
Yeah, that's a great and fascinating question, and that's sort of going to bring the mid-60s Black power through to today. It's a very good specific question because it looks at the Second Amendment, and there's an interesting play on the Second Amendment in that that is really where a lot of sort of white America is, at least those that are Second Amendment people, and a lot of them are bringing rifles to their protests in the streets now, right, from their political perspective. And if African Americans were to exercise their Second Amendment rights with their rifles, with an African American version of Jewish nationalism in the streets, I think that, you know, up until maybe a couple months ago, it would have been really, really bad, and the results would not have looked good. So I think that is, in fact, what we're looking at when we talk about dismantling systemic racism. And I want to say that in a good way and in a hard way. The good way is, yeah, I think everyone would like to say, let's get rid of racism. Generally, that's a good position to have. What does it really look like? This is going to be the challenging part for white liberals, for Jewish liberals. The Second Amendment extends to Black America, right? And if we had those scenes, I'm imagining a lot of white America is going to get really nervous. Like it's okay for one group of Americans to have their guns, but not another. And to be more, since I got a New York crowd here, right? Schools between Ocean Hill, Brownsville, teachers strike in New York. I'm from LA, so we had busing in the 70s. One of my chapters in the book is on the rise of Jewish day schools as a consequence of busing, not really less interested in the Jewish, more interested in getting your kids out of public schools. So healthcare, right? I know a bunch of you are in healthcare. When we are actually going to give healthcare to everybody in America and what that's going to look like to equalize that, these are going to be the harder moments of reckoning. And I think that my optimism is there. And if I have pessimism, it's because I've just studied a whole lot of what happens when you have to concede power. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Frederick Douglass, 1856.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marc, for this really fascinating discussion. Hopefully we can have you back to talk more about other topics related to this. And there's one hand raised from our rabbi. No? Was that an accident? Okay. I was going to give him an opportunity.
That was meant to be a clap. Oh, thank you.
Oh, yeah. That was going to fly.
Oh, it was a clap. I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining us. And hopefully we'll do this again at some point soon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay healthy and take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It will. Thank you.
Thank you.